Thank God for the gift of learning Torah together. Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai
Adonai
Eloheinu
Eloheinu
melech
melech
haolam,
haolam,
asher
asher
kiddushanu
kiddushanu
b'mitzvotav
b'mitzvotav
v'tzivanu
v'tzivanu
la'asok
la'asok
b'divrei
b'divrei
Torah.
Torah.
V'ha'arevna
V'ha'arevna
Adonai
Adonai
Eloheinu
Eloheinu
et
et
divrei
divrei
Toratcha
Toratcha
b'finu
b'finu
u'fi
b'fi
amcha
amcha
beit
beit
Yisrael.
Yisrael.
V'nihya
K'nei
anachnu
anachnu
v'tzetzaeinu
b'tzetzaeinu
v'tzetzaei
b'tzetzaei
amcha
amcha
beit
beit
Yisrael.
Yisrael.
K'lo
Kulanu
yodei
yodei shemecha
shemecha
v'lomdei
lomdei
Toratacha
Toratacha
lishma.
lishma. Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai
Adonai
hamalamed
hamelamed
Torah
Torah
la'amo
le'amo
Yisrael.
Yisrael.
Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai
Adonai
Eloheinu
Eloheinu
melech
melech
haolam,
haolam
asher
asher
bachar
bachar banu
banu
mikol
mikol ha'amim,
ha'amim
v'natan
v'natan
lanu
lanu
et
et
Torato.
Torato.
Baruch
Baruch
atah
atah
Adonai
Adonai
noten
notein
haTorah.
haTorah.
So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Oh my God, we've got just the most interesting conversation to have today about a really rich issue, and the issue is, to what extent are you allowed to bring your conscience into your religious life, in your encounter with Torah, in your encounter with mitzvot, in your encounter with tradition? Are you free to say, I really don't like this, I'm not going to do it? Or are you prohibited from saying that? Or are you encouraged to say it? So I want to introduce this with a story. Hey, Dan, good morning, good Shabbos. With a story which comes from 1992. It's a very old story. I sometimes think that the great questions in life we wrestle with all our life. And at different points, we have a different prism on this. So here's how I want to introduce our topic today. In 1992, there was a very famous story where Rabbi Harold Schulweis, who was a rabbi, he since passed away. He was a rabbi in California, in Encino, California. He was the great rabbi of his era in the conservative movement, just a towering figure. He was also very, very, very progressive, very, very, very liberal, very, very, very left, very much calling for inclusion of women and the gay and lesbian community, a generation before other people were thinking in those terms. Um, and he was utterly brilliant. And he was in conversation with Joel Roth, who was my teacher. He taught me Talmud at the seminary, and he taught me codes at the seminary. And he's a great person and a great thinker, and and a big thinker about halachic decision making. Anyway, uh, in the 80s and before, women could not be admitted to the seminary. Um, and Rabbi Roth wrote a paper using his halachic method. He looked at sources and he looked at precedents, and he came up with a rationale that allows women to be rabbis and that would allow women to be admitted to the seminary. Now it seems obvious. It was not obvious 30 years ago. It was not obvious a generation ago. And Rabbi Roth wrote the paper that made it happen. So Harold Schulweis says to Joel Roth, I read your paper and I absolutely hated it. And Joel Roth said, you hated it, but I would think that you would support the inclusion of women at the seminary. And he said, of course I support the inclusion of women at the seminary, but I hated how you got there. What was wrong with how I got there? Well, you read sources and you read precedents and you lined them up and you said, reading the sources and precedents, we can come to a conclusion that allows women to go to the seminary. Yes, Joel Roth said, that's exactly what I did. Well, I hate that, says Harold Schulweis. You hate it. Why do you hate it? Well, because what if you looked at the sources and you looked at the precedents and came to the conclusion, based on those sources and precedents, that women could not be rabbis and women could not be admitted to the seminary? Then what would you have done? Then Joel Roth said, what I would have done is said, no. We looked at the sources and they don't permit it. And then Harold Schulweis said, that's why I hate it, because it's just obvious. It's just moral that women should be rabbis. We know that from our heart. I don't need your sources, and I don't need your precedents to tell me that women in the year 1990 can be rabbis. I know it. It's just right. It's just obvious. Where's your morality? And Joel Roth said, let me pause, and I'll get to Joel Roth's answer. There's a great constitutional law scholar named John Hart Eli, who sadly passed away in the 60s from cancer, but he was like such a brilliant scholar. And he wrote a really big book. This is one of the biggest books that's been quoted by the courts over and over again, called Democracy and Distrust. And he talks, John Hart Eli, in this book about the claim that something is just moral or just obviously right. And John Hart Eli says it's really problematic because X and the opposite of X are always justified on the basis of it's just moral. It's just moral that slavery is okay. For hundreds of years, people claimed a moral right to own slaves. And to just refresh, if you read as Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, there's a whole chapter. Actually, the first pillar of caste is that God says, I can own slaves. It's just moral that I own slaves. So John Hart Ely says the argument of abolitionists that slavery is wrong morally, and the argument of slave owners, slavery is right morally, were both grounded in morality. And he shows that that happens on issue after issue after issue. So Joel Roth says to Harold Schulweis, therefore the Talmud wisely said that when Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, the last of the biblical prophets, died, Nistalka Ruach HaKodesh Misrael, the prophetic spirit died from Israel. In other words, prophets could say, thus says the Lord, I believe X because God told me. After Haggai, Malachi, and Zechariah died, we can't do that anymore. We're now rabbis, we're not prophets, and rabbis are in a legal system, and rabbis need sources and precedents. So Joel Roth said to Harold Kushner, who died and made you a prophet. That's the story. Now, I was interviewed by Joel Roth right after this story happened to get into the seminary. And he asked me, what do you think? And I told him I completely agree with Harold Schulweis. And Joel Roth said, well, I like your spirit, but I'm hoping that in the seminary I can change your mind. That's the grounding for this conversation. Now, what we're going to do today with our text, we have two different issues. One is this issue, we're just going to read a page of Torah about no Ammonites and no Moabites can ever enter the house of the Lord, because I believe it raises moral issues. We'll look at that first, and then we're going to look at this issue of gay intimacy and the teshuvah that was passed 15 years later. So, without further ado, this is the Ammonite issue is a really great laboratory because we don't actually know any Ammonites. So it's kind of an intellectual exercise, but it obviously is going to have very serious implications for how we see our conscience in Judaism. So, Lord Dan Nesson, can you get your microphone and read for us on page 1 of the handout, Deuteronomy 23, verse 4, no Ammonite or Moabite. I'll just have you read it, and then we'll talk about it after.
No Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted into the congregation of the Lord. None of their descendants, even in the 10th generation, shall ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt, and because they hired Balaam, son of Beor, from Pethor of Aram Naharaim to curse you. But the Lord your God refused to heed Balaam instead. And the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, for the Lord your God loves you. You shall never concern yourself with the welfare or benefit as long as you live.
Just read one more verse through 8.
You shall not abhor you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your kinsman. You shall not abhor an Egyptian, for you are a stranger in his land.
Okay, now, so this verse on its face says no Ammonite, no Moabite can ever be admitted into the congregation of the Lord, not for 10 generations. That means forever, right? And then the Torah gives us two rationales. One is that they weren't hospitable to us. They didn't greet us with, LaCroix seltzer and Kind bars when we were in the wilderness. They did not meet you with food and water on your journey after you left Egypt. So they weren't hospitable. They weren't warm. They weren't welcoming. They didn't have polar seltzer. And then the other is because they hired Bil'am, the son of Beor, which, by the way, just to get this out on the record, it was not the Ammonites that hired Bil'am. It was the Moabites that hired Bil'am, right? Because it's very clear that it's Balak. It's portion Balak. Balak is the king of Moab, right? So Balak, the king of Moab, hires Bil'am and tries to curse the Jews. And in this verse from Deuteronomy, the Moabites and the Ammonites are lumped together, and the Ammonites are credited with the sin of trying to hire Balaam, even though in the text the Ammonites did not try to hire Balaam. So that's it. And then it says you don't have to abhor an Egyptian because we were a stranger in his land. So, first reactions, dear colleagues. What do you think of this Torah? How would you explain this Torah? What do you think? Talk. Anybody?
So
Wait, Michelle, you can't get heated now. We're just talking about Ammonites. I mean, this is a safe.
So
This is our
I
safe space.
can I give my
Go,
interpretation
Elias.
here?
Go for it.
So there are in history, throughout history, there has been people who hate each other.
Right.
Okay, and that's not new. It will continue to happen for us human beings as long as human beings are alive, and it's sad, but it's the reality. Um, Now, I don't have a problem with that, but I have a problem with the 10th generation thing because it has been proven over and over history that grandchildren of horrible people, they have nothing to do with the grandfather or something, and they actually ask for forgiveness of behalf of somebody who perhaps they never met, and they don't agree with that. You know, we can bring so many of those examples to life. So I understand that you don't want to allow somebody who currently hates you and wants to destroy you, or people who 10 years ago did that, but the 10th generation seems like absurd.
So, Elias, let me just hear you well, and then ask you for the implications of your own thinking. So, first of all, you're absolutely right, and we have a crystalline example in modern Jewish history. Many of the descendants of Nazis, people with names like Göring and Himmler, like the worst of Hitler's henchmen, their children and grandchildren did real teshuvah, moved to Israel, and tried to rebuild Israel in expiation for their father, their grandfather's sins. So we actually see that. So what you say is literally in our own time. So now here's my question. Let's go back now to the Talmudic story, which very simply is Judah the Ammonite comes, and he says, my grandfather was a Nazi, but I'm not a Nazi. My grandfather was an Ammonite, but I want to be part of. I want to move to Israel. I want to fall in love with a beautiful woman in Jerusalem. I want to get married and be part of the Jewish community. And Rabban Gamliel says, no. There's this verse, and Rabbi Yehoshua says, yes, but not because it's immoral. Yes, because I'm going to look at the sources and precedents. We don't actually know who an Ammonite is nowadays. So how would you, given what you just said, that you don't like this verse, it feels wrong to you, what would you say to Judah and the Ammonite?
Yes, you're welcome.
And if you were in the yeshiva and you had to justify it.
You're telling me now, Elias Rosenberg, in 2021, I would say yes. But in those days, no.
Okay,
I was probably follow the law.
Okay, but I'm going to get to you, but I just want to say, even now, okay, Elias in 2021, you would say yes to Judah the Ammonite on what basis? On the basis that we don't know what an Ammonite is, or on the basis that what the Torah says here is just not our morality?
Neither one. On the basis that we in the conservative movement allow anybody who wants to join us.
Okay.
So I thank you, Elias. I love that. I actually I feel like you're setting out sort of two options, and I'm not sure that those are the only options on the table. Either you're legalistic and small, or you are moral and you're speaking with a voice that animates you from the depths of your soul because it's right. And I think there are other options here. And I actually think the verse itself here that you have can kind of lead you to one, because classically our rabbis interpret, why is it that the Ammonites and the Moabites are on our bad list, right? And there are two things that come right in a row. One is they didn't meet you with food and water, as you so beautifully said, no seltzer for you, no kind bars for you.
Right.
But they then pair that. They say it's not for nothing that they're mentioning Bil'am here, because actually what Bil'am shows is that they had money. They actually had it. It wasn't that they just didn't, you could have said maybe they didn't meet you because they didn't have enough. But Bil'am, and hiring Bil'am means they offered money to him to curse, and that's true hatred, because they reserved their funds. So this is the classic sort of rabbinic take on this, that this is a paradigm.
But that's the Moabites, not the Ammonites.
Okay, but hold on a second. No, the
Moabites
Moabites are brought as that example of somebody who is so spiteful, so hateful that they hold on to what they have, they won't share. And what that means to me is that the Torah gives us a whole other option here. We don't have to look at only the legal details and only the exact words that are written here.
Right.
And we don't have to say, I hate this. It speaks, it doesn't speak to my moral voice. We can actually come and interpret. We can choose to read this in different ways. We can choose to say, maybe this isn't about what we think it's about.
Michelle, why not call out hate for being hate?
It's possible it's also not hate. I want to echo what Michelle's saying, and it's funny. I find myself on like a side that I'm not normally on this, but when I think about allowing entry into our people, which is not just about getting married, it's also about like your national security. It's also about your well-being. And I think about like what our government does in terms of immigration. Like if you're and I think we're reading this, it feels like, how could you exclude someone for 10 generations for not giving you seltzer and kind bars? Like that's obviously that's crazy. But
Right.
What if there's more intensity there, and what if there's actually more of a national security risk? I mean, like, I think if somebody who was a child of a Taliban leader wanted to come to this country and was a really good person, but they were the child of a Taliban leader, it's hard for me to imagine our government would say like, come on in, like we're gonna trust you. They're gonna say like, you're too close. You're too close to that terrorist organization. You're too close to really harmful actions against our country. We can't trust that you're your own person
Right.
coming from where you come from. And I'm not, it's not right. But I think that there also is a sense of like self-preservation. And I'm not, I don't want to say that in all cases, I think it's appropriate
Right.
to judge people for 10 generations. That's certainly not what I'm saying. But I am saying that I don't think that
So let me guys. So I just want to.
You need to clarify something for everybody.
Yes.
When you say call it hate, what do you mean by call it hate? You are calling hate that the Jews are not allowed the Moabites to be part of us, or you are calling
that the
hate
Moabites
that the Moabites hate the Jewish people?
Right.
No,
And
I'm
also-
calling it. This to me is racism. The Torah
Which
guilt.
side?
The Torah.
Which
God,
side?
the Torah.
Right.
Us,
Which
us,
side?
us.
Good,
This
right.
I
is
don't see it
Jewish.
that way.
This is Jewish racism.
I don't see
This
it
let
is
me just-
great Jewish
let-
complexity,
No.
Wes.
This is Jewish racism, and let me just make the case why it's Jewish racism, and how very challenging this verse is to me. Okay, first of all, and I want to bring this into the conversation and ask you two questions about it. It says no Ammonite or Moabite shall be admitted for 10 generations, but the tradition rejects this. Not me rejects this. The tradition rejects this because, of course, the book of Ruth that we read in 2 weeks tells us that Ruth is a Moabite and 10 generations from Ruth. The way that we read the book of Ruth, and the last word of the book of Ruth is it traces 10 generations. And who guesses the 10th generation? David, who is the grandson of a Moabite. So not only is he not included in the congregation of the Jews, he is the king of the Jews.
Which
right?
means we got
can I
there.
just finish? It's a complete the biblical tradition and the David tradition literally categorically rejects this verse and says David is the king of the Jews, not excluded from the Jews. Okay? Now, but here's the thing. So what does the halachic tradition, the sources and precedents tradition do? It looks at it to me, it's just something so uncompelling, and to me actually obscene. What does it do? It says lo yavo. It's obscene because it doesn't actually engage the real issues. I don't like religion to not engage the real issues, right? I don't like a sleight of hand. Here was what it says. How does the Talmud deal with the fact that David, who by rights of this verse should be excluded from the congregation of Jews, is the king of the Jews? How does it do it? It says lo yavo amoni umoavi bikal Adonai. A Moabite can't be admitted into that congregation. Well, Moavi, says the rabbinic tradition, is masculine. It doesn't say Moaviyah, a female Moabite. And Ruth is a female Moabite. She's a Moaviyah, not a Moabite. So this verse is intact. And Ruth doesn't violate it. And King David doesn't violate it. What do you think of that?
No.
Let me
Lisa,
just
because she's going to agree with you. As the ones that don't think like you.
Wait, yeah.
Can I say something? I need to
Yeah.
say something because I've been trying. So, sorry, Alisa, I will give you the
I think
option
I
of
agree
talking.
with him. I don't think I agree with him.
So let's be going back a little bit in time for a couple of anecdotes as well. So two things I want to bring up. I had the privilege of doing several trips to the world, visiting Jewish communities with Temple Emmanuel members. The first episode that I will never forget was in Seville, in Spain. We were touring the Jewish neighborhood, and the person giving the tour was a very lovely young Spanish woman, mid-20s, who was giving us the tour. Obviously, she's Catholic and very Catholic. And she says to us at one point, this is the Jewish neighborhood. She was wonderful and very sweet. And at one point she says, when the Jewish people left Spain, and some of the people traveling with me say, wait a minute, why you're saying left? You mean expelled? You mean burned to life? You mean forced to convert? Well, yeah, that's your interpretation. You know, and how many generations of Moabites are we talking about here? It's 500 years after, okay? Second.
What's your point? What's the point of that? It's a
Let me
very
get there. Let me get
powerful
Rabbi West.
story.
I'm a rabbi. I'm surrounded by rabbi. I need to expose my view.
Okay, it's a great story, but what's the point?
We are in
Okay.
Poland. And Poland, as you know, Michelle, and everybody who traveled with us 2 years ago, Poland is very different from Germany. The Polish people say we had nothing to do with the Holocaust. We were taken over by Germany. We had nothing to do. This is the guy who says it's in the pasuk. My hands are tied. Okay. What I'm saying is that for some reason, and take me seriously, and I don't want to hurt your feelings.
Yes.
For some reason, you are focused very much in finding the hate of our own tradition when you are not able to see the hate of other people towards us.
No, opposite. It's because I am keenly aware of the hate of other people towards us that we dare never do to others what we don't like being done to us. We know what it is like to be hated upon, Elias Rosenberg. We know what it is like to say no Jews allowed, and therefore, shame on us for saying no Ammonites allowed. I get the hate,
Thank you for
but
clarifying
just
that.
not reflect the hate.
My turn?
Yes.
Don't agree with Wes.
So I just want to, I think this is there's an important frame here in that we got into this conversation with Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yoshua. Rabban Gamliel is somebody who's trying to preserve tradition. He's trying to make sure that the traditions that were established in Jerusalem that were threatened by exile do not go extinct. He's trying to make sure that people have a sense of being able to go to Torah for wisdom and that he's able to preserve that for future generations. Now I'm going to do an Elias, and I wanted to tell also a story.
But Pia,
Because
by the way,
wait,
you should tell the crowd what you
Yes.
told me
I'll
yesterday.
get-
She has a thing for Rabban Gamliel.
Okay,
She just loves
but-
Rabban Gamliel, which is kind of skewing. She's prejudiced in favor of Rabban Gamliel. Keep
I
going.
just want to say that
It's true. Keep going.
you're the one that's advocating bringing people into loving people and seeing people and valuing people and not
Right.
excluding them. So I would think my love of Rabban Gamliel would help me to see the truth in this matter. But that's a side note. I'm fine to share that. It's fine.
Right.
I think Rabban Gamliel is pretty amazing. I shared with Wes on the Viva that I always like learning about him in yeshiva in Israel. I just thought he was amazing. I love what he does. I think he's a really profound person who has struggles. He doesn't have a great filter. He's not great at representing his ideas, but I really admire his integrity, and he has a beautiful name. And I often thought about like using that name in the future. Unfortunately, Solomon does not agree. So not that we're there yet, but that's a thing. But what I want to share is my Rabbi Rav Zalman Schachter Shalom Yalev Shalom used to talk about he built this new version of Judaism called Jewish Renewal, which is a way of encountering Judaism in a personally relevant, emotionally connected, vibrant way. And he was pretty radical in some of his interpretations of halakha and some of his interpretations of what we should do. But in everything he did, he said you have to be backwards compatible, meaning like if I create the world's best word processing operating system, word processing program for a computer, but it won't allow you to open Word documents from other people that other people sent you, and it won't allow you to access, PDFs from the internet, then no matter how phenomenal that word processing document is, no one's going to use it because it doesn't allow them to access tradition. And so what I hear the rabbis doing and what I think you're opposed to is they're creating a word processing document that's backwards compatible that allows you to open and operate previous documents. And that's all I'm advocating for here. I'm saying we want to have a tradition that's both backwards and forwards compatible. We want to have a tradition that allows us to understand what came before us, to process that, to download it, and then to move forward.
But I'm just bursting. I'm bursting because you have such. What I love about you have such a clear moral voice. Like you're of the five of us, you're just like really leading on racial justice. You have such a clear moral voice. Okay, when you say that the rabbinic move, it says, you know, lo yavo moavi, a male Moabite shall not be admitted, and Ruth is a Moabiyah. And therefore, this whole thing, we don't have an issue, people. We don't have an issue. She's a Moabiyah, not a Moabite. The law is okay. David can be our king. How is the same moral conscience of yours that's animated by Isabel Wilkerson, that's animated by George Floyd? Where is that when it comes to this? Why are you good with a dry technicality? What about your conscience that is otherwise animated in 21st century America?
Because I think that within this, you're reading this as racist. You're saying that the reason that we exclude Moabites and Ammonites is because we have a racist reason to hate them. And what this text says is these are people that actively tried to harm you and deny you sustenance. And we don't allow people that are actively trying to harm you or deny you sustenance. We don't allow them or their children. And I'm with you, but
the book of Ruth says to the contrary. The book of Ruth says to the contrary.
The book of Ruth says, look, there are cases in which historical wrongs aren't real now. And what the rabbis are saying is that Ruth is not this story, and that there are ways of reading people that are not this story. And so we have this tradition that says that when there are people that are endangering our lives, we don't allow those people to get close to us. We want to make sure that we're safe. But that doesn't mean that we are free from just writing everybody off. We have to, in every generation, we have to look at people and we have to ask, does this person match the description of the Moabite and Ammonite that's here? Or is this person a new person? And I wouldn't go off the gender thing, like, oh, it's not that, okay, fine, it's a male, female thing. That's bogus. But I think the act of saying Ruth is different, there's a way to say that I'm going to hold a national security standard that also allows me to look at each person and vet each person appropriately. And I'm not saying, I'm alive to racism. I'm certainly not advocating for racism. I don't see that in this text.
Okay,
Right. By the way,
Wait. This is
So I just
purely
wanna put-
discrimination.
Right.
When I was talking, you say, "What's your point?" She took much longer than me to say, and you never said, "What's your point?"
So I want to hear Dan's voice too. Just let me put an exclamation mark on Eliza's story about the backwards compatibility, because I think, when we get into the Talmud here, we see that Rabbi Yoshua actually does exactly what you're saying. He says, this case isn't that. We actually can't identify this case as that. And that is the entire rabbinic endeavor with regard to Torah. There is so much in the Torah that when we look at it, it's very deeply troubling. And it was deeply troubling to our rabbis too. So to assume that we have a moral compass that they didn't have, it's sometimes true. They weren't as progressive as us on certain issues. But by and large, the entire moral process that we engage in today was lifted by their having said, I can look at these verses of Torah, and there are a lot of them, and they don't mean what the literal interpretation of the Torah means. An eye for an eye must not mean an eye for an eye. By the way, right, this very verse does not and cannot mean what we think that it means. And therefore, we have to always be engaged in a process of interpretation that is led by our moral lens, but is backward compatible with the sources that we have, because that has staying power. It's not just me screaming up on a mountain, this is right, this is just. It's about moving an entire people towards a goal.
Okay, Dan, last comment on this, and then we're going to pivot.
I want to go back to the text, and what I find interesting is that you're using the concept of the Ammonites hating us. I think there's a difference between hate and uncaring. And that's what's being reflected here. It says they didn't greet you with food and water. They didn't. It's because they didn't really care. If it wasn't a matter of hate; it was a matter of not caring. And the two other examples that they bring that it's okay to like an Edomite and an Egyptian is like totally irrational. That's the text is crazy in that point.
Yes.
I mean, the Egyptians enslaved us for 400 years. There's hatred there, right? I
Right.
would say, and also in Edom, we think of Edom. That's the Babylonians. Those are the ones that
Destroyed the first
destroyed us, right? So I mean, obviously that's forward reading,
Right.
but those two people, those two groups of people clearly hate.
Right.
Ammonites, I think, is different of just being uncaring, and maybe there's a message of that it's worse to be uncaring than it is to be hateful,
Okay.
or
Okay.
at least to think about that anyway.
Great. So I wanna bring this piece to a close and pivot the following way. I, by the way, agree with all of you in different ways that the rabbis here, both Rabbi Yehoshua, when he says yes to Judah the Ammonite, he's motivated by a moral a worldview, which is it's wrong to exclude Judah the Ammonite. But the way that I can express my moral viewpoint is not to call it moral. I can, I want to make it backwards compatible, so I'll say I don't know what an Ammonite is, and I agree that the rabbinic tradition that reads the book of Ruth and says it's okay because she's a Moaviyah, not a Moavi. I think it's dry and technical. They think, well, I have a moral concern, but I want to keep the sources and precedents and legal system intact, and so I'm going to apply a moral concern through a legal argument, which will make it backwards compatible. And here's my question. When does backwards compatible become backwards? What is the cost? What is the cost of having a moral voice and not asserting it? Having a moral voice and not asserting it because you want to make it backwards compatible. So here is, we could actually have many hours of conversation on this, but I want to just frame it up and just read a page and a half and ask you a single question. So 2,000 years later, the law committee of the conservative movement is debating the question of gay intimacy and the verse from Leviticus that calls an abomination. Okay? And there are three positions. Of course, Rabbi Roth, who says, the pasuk says what it says, the verse says what it says, my hands are tied, right? And then the other two positions. So Gordon Tucker writes the paper that speaks in a clear and unabashed moral voice. And he calls for what he calls, his word is normalization of gay intimacy. That is to say, from a moral point of view, from a Jewish point of view, from a halachic point of view, from a rabbi and cantor officiating at a wedding in the Rabbi Samuel Chill sanctuary point of view, there is no difference between a bride and a groom, and a bride and a bride, or a groom and a groom. If it's love, we're going to sanctify it. Okay? And no limitations or issues or restrictions. Okay. That position gets not enough votes to pass. Okay? The paper that passes is written by Danny Nevins, who's currently the dean of the rabbinical school, and Elliot Dorff, who's a great rabbi and the most fecund, fertile mind and teacher and writer of responsa in the conservative movement. And they come together and write a paper which is going to look at sources and precedents, not based on the moral argument. They're clearly motivated by the moral argument. And they also give voice to the moral argument. They talk about human dignity. That's a moral category. They talk about avoiding pain and humiliation. That's a moral category. They talk about be treated the way you'd want others to treat you. That's a moral category. They talk about it's not good to be left alone, that's to live alone. That's a moral category. But in the end of the game, and so for all those reasons, they say it's not an abomination. But at the end of the game, at the end of the day, when they read the sources and precedents, they cannot say that all gay intimacy is okay. They say it's not an abomination, and gay rabbinical students can come to the seminary. But they specifically exclude how gay men have intercourse. And they say anal intercourse is forbidden. This is the only teshuvah that has that phrase in it. Anal intercourse is forbidden. So what they do, so because of the sources and precedents, the way that gay men often make love is explicitly prohibited by the teshuvah. So we now have the following result, okay? The conservative movement has two position papers that say yes to gay intimacy. The one that we all actually follow is not passed. And the one that is passed, we would never in a million years actually follow. We would never tell a gay couple you can't have intimacy. We would never be in their bedroom. We would never even think of going there. Okay? So my question to you is there a cost of being backwards compatible that means sometimes you're just backwards? So here's the question I want to ask you. Now, Michelle pointed out to me last week that Danny Nevins, who co-authored this paper, and it was from a verse in Kedoshim, wrote a Torah commentary last week reflecting on 15 years later. And in this commentary, Michelle, I'm going to ask you to read most of it. He recants and repents of a lot of things. 15 years later, it feels there's a lot that he repents of. Here's my question for you, and it's a real question. Does he repent of the basic, fundamental, to me, flaw in the paper, which is he says gay intimacy is not an abomination, but gay men can't make love the way they make love? Does he repent of that? Does he repent of that or not? And so let's pick it up with Michelle, if you will read on page 6 of the bottom, when the Torah prohibits sexual intercourse.
Calling their lovemaking an abomination, there is no avoiding our discomfort and increasingly our disagreement with this ancient text. The rabbis gifted us with techniques of non-literal interpretation, and modern readers have offered more acceptable approaches to these verses. For example, they might read to prohibit only cultic or coercive or unloving or incestuous sex between men. Still, the most honest and useful approach is to admit these verses have been understood for millennia to condemn sexual intimacy between men. Today, we understand this ban to be hurtful and oppressive. What is to be done? Every year, thousands of Jews present essays and speeches struggling with these texts, using them as a foil for our own evolving understanding of gender and sexuality. This itself is a redemptive response, but we also need to revise communal norms. Within conservative Judaism, we have tried different approaches, some effective, but none entirely satisfying. 15 years ago, I joined with 2 other rabbis in composing a responsum that placed the Torah's heteronormative assumptions in tension with its own teachings about human dignity and the value of intimate partnership in life. We argued that the Torah's declaration that it is not good for a person to be alone is commandment to love one another as ourselves, and its warning to avoid humiliating and harming others were all in tension with the ban found on gay sex here. So too, with the expansions added by the rabbis on sex between women, the cultural assumptions of their time undermine some of the rabbis' most beautiful teachings about respecting and protecting one another. The ancient rabbis said, "So great is human dignity that it supersedes a negative principle of Torah." As modern rabbis, we applied this powerful idea to our contemporary reality and to protect the dignity of all people in our day. I would like to take this opportunity, nearly 15 years later, to appreciate the positive impact of our responsum and to revise some of its less beneficial claims. On the positive side, almost immediately after our paper was approved in 2006, Jews and other people of faith began to discuss sexuality through the lens of dignity. The tone of discourse changed, certainly within our own denomination, and so did the policies. Synagogues, schools, and camps changed their rhetoric, and queer youth, adults, and families were gradually and then suddenly embraced as dignified members and leaders of their communities. Our seminaries in New York and Los Angeles quickly shifted to admitting gay and lesbian applicants, as did our school in Jerusalem 5 years later. Dozens of remarkable rabbis and cantors who openly identified as LGBTQI+ now lead our communities, and we have benefited from a richer and more diverse covenantal community. It's hard to remember just how different things were 15 or 20 years ago. Encountering ancient text on matters so intimate is always difficult. Sometimes a text from only 15 years ago can feel ancient, and I admit that that is true of my own work. We use the word homosexuality in our title to signal a scholarly and unbiased approach that might convince skeptical readers, including fellow law committee members whose votes we needed. But for many readers, that term already felt passé and even hurtful in its clinical tone. We should have been consistent in using the language preferred by gay and lesbian Jews, for whose benefit the paper was intended. Our core halachic claim was that sexual orientation is a fixed feature for many people, and that the prior demand that gay and lesbian people suppress their sexuality and try to pass as straight was demeaning, cruel, and futile. As such, it violated the rabbinic principle of human dignity, causing shame and suffering, which are themselves biblically forbidden. In passing, we commented that for bisexual people, it might be difficult but not impossible to restrict themselves to ancient heterosexual norms. This comment was problematic at the time and has caused pain and anger, which I deeply regret. Bisexuality is its own identity, often misunderstood, that deserves respect and protection from hurtful comments and policies. Our paper should either have included bisexuals in its conceptual framework or left their questions for a different responsum, much as we left transgender issues for a different project. The interpretation of Torah is an evolving and expanding activity. For millennia, male rabbis argued that only men were obligated to study Torah, and they fought to preserve their monopoly on the spiritual inheritance that rightfully belongs to all Jews. Men built this patriarchy, and men may be partners in the task of dismantling it. But it is the scholarship and activism of women that has been the driving force in this change. The same is true of LGBTQI plus Jews who have emerged from being objects of rabbinic interest to subjects and authors of Jewish discourse. The prior closeting and oppression of these Jews is an ongoing source of pain and shame. The new era of openness and gay pride is the beginning of a holier and greater stage of Jewish history. Do you want me to keep going? As I approach the end of my term as JTS Dean, I am inspired and thrilled by the diverse identities of our students and alumni. Many of our wisest and most prominent teachers today have identities that were recently excluded from leadership. This is not true only for sexual and gender identity, but also for Jews of color and those living with disability. As a straight white male who was raised Jewish, I recognize how privileged my position has been. I have committed myself to removing barriers so the Torah can be enriched by diverse perspectives and our communities can rise to their potential. Much more work remains to expand the palace of Torah so that its paradoxes can become constructive challenges. Only then may we fulfill the Torah's most expansive command. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy.
So, here's my question. Just to get down to the brass tacks, because the time is limited. Does he, in this revised statement, deal with the fact that his paper specifically prohibits gay men from having intimacy the way gay men have intimacy? Does he deal with that or not? And what do you think about this revision 15 years later?
So one of the things that I love, and in fact I highlighted about this self-reflective piece, is that in it he entertains that actually there were other ways that he could have approached this problem. There were other possibilities that he didn't necessarily see or accept before him that he could have chosen. So I think he doesn't ultimately come out and say, I'm sorry, I wish I had never put in that exclusion. It's clearly morally wrong. That's not here. But what is here is I missed something. I was looking for an interpretation. I was looking for a way out, and I missed it because over the years, people have said things like, you could imagine this as this only prohibits cultive or coercive or unloving relationships. There were different ways I could have interpreted this, which would have seen the human dignity in a better way. So I do see that here. There's also something so, I think, really important. And as you say, don't miss this. Don't miss this, right? Which is that he says, ultimately, I had to be the one to put this forward because it couldn't have come forward without straight white men doing this. But fundamentally, until our system includes those who are being legislated about in the conversation, the conversation cannot possibly be complete. It cannot achieve its goals while we are legislating about somebody else or talking about people who are not in the room. That ultimately the true act of human dignity is to bring everyone into the conversation.
Subjects, not objects. What were other people's reactions to his piece 15 years later?
So I think that, you asked if the approach of precedence and textual analysis was backwards or forwards. And I think one of the things that he acknowledges is that though it feels backwards now, in the time it was forwards. And the time what his paper was, it wasn't for all the people for whom that was a moral clarity. This paper wasn't for those. I mean, it was to protect their rights. It was to protect their inclusion. But really, this paper was for all the people that were ready to use text to prevent people from gaining access and inclusion. And so I think that there are roles for both. And I admire his willingness to reflect, and I admire his willingness to reflect openly and to be vulnerable in this way. I wish he'd gone a little further in terms of apologizing for what was included and for the damage that has done. But I think that his paper played an important role, and that's why tradition is an evolving practice. It doesn't stop anywhere. It's continuing to evolve, and we have an obligation to continue doing this interpretation because what we do matters, and it matters for future generations, and our work now is going to set the stage for a more righteous and holy and wholesome world.
Yeah, we all make mistakes in our lives, and we all think differently than 15 years ago in many things. So it's very courageous of him to come up with this reflection. That being said, I would have swapped. I know it's important to everybody, but I think it was more important for him to say, not to spend a paragraph in the term of homosexual or gay and lesbians, but saying, the way gay and lesbian people have sex, it doesn't matter. In their own privacy, they can do whatever they feel like. Right. That would have been more important to me than the other paragraph.
Right. And I'm also mindful of a meta experience going on here because his point is that these conversations require people who are the subject of the conversation to be participants in the conversation. And here we are in a room of straight identifying rabbis who actually, and cantors, who I would say that we need the voice. The question that you're asking is not one to ask of us. It's actually one to ask of our gay and lesbian and bisexual and LGBTQI plus brothers and sisters, and to say to them, how does this feel to you?
Right. Lord Nesson.
Yeah, I'm with Elias on this. I think that I'm with all of you. I think the idea is that it was very courageous of Danny to revisit this. He could have gone further, but I think it's implicit in what he said that he was actually looking for forgiveness for his mistake. In that teshuva, and it's true that the way that all of us think. I mean, the way that I think about this issue, I reflect about this because when I 40 years ago I thought about this very differently than I do now, and I admit that I don't understand people that don't consider that don't think like I do. On the other hand, I'm much more tolerant of that, and that's something that's only developed over the past, I would say 10 years or less even, with my own personal reflections. But I think that the idea of being able to not not hold yourself to say, I said this once and I'm not going to go back and revisit it, I think is a really important move. And I think that's really this is really the Talmud Talmudic tradition being alive. The idea that once it's written down, that we as Jews say, okay, it's written down and we say this, but on the other hand, let's look at this and let's look at this and let's look at this. And the fact that we as a movement and that we as Jews can say, okay, there were 3 papers written. The one that we're going to follow is the one that wasn't passed by the law committee. Is an idea that's also, I think, really significant. The idea that we can look at our lives and say, okay, we the minority opinions are valid and also acceptable.
Thank you, Dan. So I just want to end with what I took away from Danny's piece, which I loved. And it's a piece of spiritual work that I have to do, which is what I loved about his work was it's measured and it's humble. And it's and he's willing to see where he was wrong. And it's for me personally, it's very hard on issues that I care about personally, that are emotional. You know, I have two gay sons, so this is not an academic issue. It's personal. It's not like a study. It's Nat. It's Sam. It's my sons. It's our sons. It's Nat and Davide, his husband, and Sam. It's when you care, how can you be measured? When it's personal, how can you be humble and receptive and listen? When it's your life, how do you stand back and say, maybe I was wrong? And that to me is the homework I take from the spiritual work that I take from Danny. I find this issue of, you know, this is like the old Jewish joke with you're right, and you're both right, because it is true that if you leave a world of sources and precedents and go to a world of morality, that's just bedlam because everybody's morality is different. But it is also true that there is a danger and a risk that sometimes backwards compatible becomes backwards. And I think there is a cost to having a moral core that decides an issue but not confessing it, and to leaving the moral core that is the engine of your decision making, leaving that unexpressed and coming up with technical arguments. I think there's a cost to that. And how to balance all that is a question. So because we are going to be standing at Sinai in a few weeks, and because this is such a rich issue, I wanted to schedule a special session tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And this is wonderful because my colleagues and I get to talk about these issues. But I want to talk about these issues with you. And I have saved the hardest issue for last, which is tomorrow morning. There is actually a provision in the Torah, which is called Ben Sorer Umorer, where parents take their child, their son, to the town elders to have the son stoned to death. And that's obviously just so horrible. And the question is, can we call that immoral? Can we call that immoral? And the Talmud is going to wrestle with that. And I would love to hear your voices on that and on these issues tomorrow morning at 10. Shabbat Shalom, and we'll see you in Shul.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone.